Corporal Angelus was out in the front lines there, a little bit ahead of where I was dug in. And so I got up and I was able to move. It was daylight at that time. So I was able to get up and I moved ahead, and I found Angelus laying on the ground there, and I laid down beside of him, and as I remember, I lifted his helmet a little bit to the side, and I tried to speak to him, and then I realized that he was dead at that time. And so as I started to get up, I was laying down, I started to get up, all of a sudden, I felt something go through my leg, hit me. And what it was apparently a Japanese sniper who was trained in on that area, and he shot me at that time. I had just come from church, and we had arrived at our home in Glendale, California, and the news came over around noontime, I believe it was. At that time, I didn't know that much about it. I didn't realize that we might be in a conflict where we were going to be in a war. It was a little spooky for me thinking about war and everything else. I wasn't in the service or anything. I was just a Boy Scout at that time. But things eventually turned around another way, though.
Why did you enlist at 17, and why did you choose the Navy?
I was working. I was going to high school at the time, and working after high school doing war work for a company called Gladdy McBean. And one of the supervisors there was a Navy veteran. He had been discharged from the Navy as a result of falling down the hatch of a submarine, and he was out, but he talked about the merits of the Navy, about clean sleep, sheets, and one thing or another. So John Rulon, my friend and buddy, we both thought this was great, so we signed up for the Navy in Burbank, California.
Where did you go for training?
My original training was, upon joining the Navy, was in Los Angeles to get the train station there, and we were to go to Idaho. At that time, they had a naval facility called Camp Farragut. It was in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and that's where the train was going to take us to Spokane, Washington, and then from Spokane we went over to Coeur d'Alene, and that's where I went through my boot camp training for the Navy.
How did you get assigned as a medic?
Apparently, through the information when you sign up for going into the service, there's information about your parents and their livelihood and one thing or another, and it happened that my mother happened to be a nurse, and they looked at the situation and figured from my background this was probably a good field to put Charles into, so that's why I ended up in the Navy as a pharmacist mate or hospital apprentice.
When you're doing your corpsman training, what are you trained to treat?
Well, any type of wound that you would get, a gunshot wound to the lung area or to the head, and administering morphine for patients who were they were suffering a lot of pain, and you would identify these people with a thing on their forehead, so when they were moved back to a battalion aid station, they knew that they had had morphine injections for pain and one thing or another, and just the preliminary work that you could do in the field.
What did you carry with you?
The normal gear that a pharmacist made or a Navy corpsman would have would be about 50-some pounds of medical gear, which would carry dressings and battle dressings and all sorts of medical gear, morphine, and other things. You couldn't give any blood transfusions or everything. That would be done in a later area in a battalion aid station, but it would be the necessary first aid that you would render to the injured person, the injured Marine or Navy personnel.
Where did you go first once you were sent to the Pacific Theater?
Originally, when we left the States here, we didn't know where we were going. Everything was kept secret, I guess, make sure that there wasn't any information given out that would peril the troops. But we went from there to the Hawaiian Islands. We went to an area where the 2nd Marine Division, who had been fighting at Tarawa, had been, and they had vacated the camp at Camp Tarawa, which is in the the southern island of Kyushu. It wasn't Kyushu, it was Hawaii, the big island. And that's where we did all of our training. Some of the training that we did in that area was volcanic because it had a volcano on the island, 2 of them. And apparently, because of the island of Iwo Jima, which is an old volcano, maybe the similarity between the two is why we trained there.
And you were attached to the 5th Marine Division, is that correct?
I was attached to Company A, 1st Battalion, 26 Marines, in the 5th Marine Division.
And so, when it was time to invade Iwo Jima, tell me about the invasion, coming ashore.
Well, the night before the invasion, I slept on top deck. Below deck, you were in not bunks, but kind of like hammocks in there, about 7 deep in there. And it was hot, and I just couldn't sleep that well. But you could get out on the deck, and they wouldn't allow you to even wear a watch, which had a fluorescent glow to it, for fear that maybe somebody would be able to see the thing and bomb the ship or something. But anyway, I stayed out on the, till the early morning shelling started on Iwo Jima. And then from there, went back down, and I believe it was 2 o'clock in the morning. We had steak and eggs. That's a good combat breakfast. I guess they figured troops were going to need good food and healthy bodies, so that's what we had that morning. And then later in the morning, we knew all the shelling that was going on the island, and naval gunfire that was going on and everything else. We knew we were going to go in there. We didn't go in until around 11 or 12 in the morning, I guess it was. That we went in and on, so we didn't go in on the track vehicles at that time. Some of the original people at the 9 o'clock morning went in on track vehicles, Amtraks and water buffaloes or things of that nature. But we went in what we called LCVPs, landing craft vehicle personnel, where the gate went down, the front door went down, and you went charging out of it.
And how did it go on your LCVP?
Well, it was kind of hairy because we didn't know what to expect. And some of the beaches had been so cluttered up with equipment, not being able to get in there, and with the volcanic sand and ash that they had from the volcanoes on that island, it made it rather difficult. So some of the original plans didn't go as they were supposed to. But we eventually landed down on the beach there, and I remember digging into a foxhole in the granite and the volcanic ash there. I had a little book that I had. It was a Catholic missionary book, and I opened it up, and it just opened up to a page called The Act of Resignation, and I thought, oh my Lord, maybe this is the end of things. So anyway, I read that and tried to get formulated with the company that we had and tried to take care of some of the fellas as we moved off the beach. We moved over to the one end of the island. We were down where the big volcano was, where Mount Suribachi was, where the Japanese were pretty well dug in, and we moved from there and camped at the base of Mount Suribachi that night. In fact, the area that we dug into, well, you didn't really have to dig. There were a lot of artillery holes and mortar shell holes, and you had a place where you could dig in, but some of that volcanic sand would come in on you. And the area that we dug into was an old bayonet course, so it was kind of spooky that night. we didn't know whether the Japanese were coming in on us or what was going on that way because of the statues and things that they use for bayonet course training.
Did you come under fire while you were coming in on the boat?
No, no fire whatsoever. The Japanese had been subdued with the bombings and all the rest of it at that time. So when we came in, it was fine. But after we got there on the beach, then all hell broke loose.
Tell me about that.
Well, it was just a situation where none of the LCVPs that were coming in, they were getting jammed up. They were getting bombed from the Japanese artillery and shelling. They used Mount Suribachi as a focal point to direct fire from the northern end of the island. The island of Iwo Jima was only about 7 miles in length. It was very short, so it was pretty well populated with artillery and mortar shells.
How badly was your company getting hit?
Well, it's pretty hard to tell because my direct influence in the situation was with Company A, 1st Battalion. 26 Marines was the 1st platoon, which also I took care of the assault squad, which was the flamethrowers and BAR and the demolition people, as well as the regular mortar people and the infantry people in Company A in the infantry division. There was a machine gun squad and the rest of those. So I was pretty well worked up with what I was doing.
How busy were you treating injuries on the beach?
Not on the beach so much. After we started to move in over towards the base of Mount Suribachi, that's where I started seeing some of the troops and realizing the ghastliness of what war with people laying in the ground there and one thing or another, whether they were alive or dead or nothing, because we weren't the first troops that went in there. We went in a little bit later that morning and took care of the troops.
What kind of injuries were you seeing?
They were mostly wounds that were pretty ghastly as far as the damage was concerned. It wasn't so much from just rifle shots or anything. It was more from artillery or mortar shellings and things of that nature. But later that evening, after we had dug in, and I had dug in, I didn't have anybody with me. I didn't have any partner or anything to dig in, but you didn't have to worry so much about finding a hole to get into. Mortar shells or artillery shells would make holes, and that would be your, So that particular night, I dug in right into the middle of a bayonet course. So I didn't treat too many people that night or anything else. For the next morning, that's when things started going. We thought we were the cat's pajamas here. We were told we were going to move up the one side of the island on the other side of the Suribachi and move up that way. Well, we did. We moved in a hurry, but around noontime that day, we ran into a cliff area where the Japanese had dug in and they could shell us and fight us that way. And so we were stopped at that area, and then it ended up we had to retreat back a little ways to another rest area.
Talk about that combat.
Well, at that time, when we had moved back, we could see ahead of us some of the Japanese running from one cave to another, and we could see them. And at that time, I remember I had a weapon. I had a .45, but I'd also had a carbine weapon. And so I tried shooting that thing at the Japanese who we could see moving ahead of us. But I don't recall ever hitting anybody with the, the distance was something else, and you couldn't tell whether you had hit or subdued a Japanese soldier or anything.
Now, you mentioned that you were also attached to the assault squad.
Correct. That was the flamethrower and the BAR and the demolition people. And at that time, they couldn't do too much because they weren't right on the front line where the caves were, and some of the other mountainous area. When we talk about mountains, I didn't really mean high mountains. These were just kind of low mountains that caused a little bit of a problem as far as it wasn't flat ground.
How long did it take to get up to the caves?
Well, we did the second day we moved up to the area where the caves were, but then because of the Japanese gunfire, we had to pull back again to another area, and that's where we stationed back towards the beach area. Moved back 200-300 yards, I guess it was. That was quite a distance in a war like that. It was such a small island, only 7 square miles.
I was very interested to read in your story that you were actually able to go into the caves eventually.
Well, that had been after we had been on the front line. We'd been on the front line for 4 days. And they would bring some of the chow or food that we would have. We had mostly cave rations. There's breakfast, dinners, and suppers, they called it, I don't know. And that was for about 4 days we were doing that. And we were pulled back to a rear area where we could see what was going on. And that was, I'm trying to remember on a daily basis, whether it was the 4th or 5th day, that the flag went up on the top of Mount Suribachi. That's where we could see. We were down at the bottom. We could see commotion going on up there, and the 28th Marines had made. We knew they were on that part of the island, and they'd gone up and made the flag raising there. And then from there on, I went snooping around with part of the assault squad. We got into some of the caves and one thing or another that had been shelled and one thing or another, and there were a lot of Japanese soldiers that were dead there, and I had picked up a piece of equipment. I thought it was a good thing to take back as a souvenir, but it wasn't. It was some part of an artillery piece, but I think the important thing was that I had found a Japanese soldier, and I had taken the flag. They wrapped it around their waist, and I'd taken it off of him, and I have that as a souvenir of Iwo Jima at that time.
That's amazing. You're one of the first people I've talked to who went into the caves, actually. I've heard stories about how they had hospitals underground and other elaborate facilities. What did you see?
Well, I didn't get into where in the hospitals or first aid stations that they had. They were mostly battle conditions where they put snipers and other people who had a clear avenue of sight of troops coming in on them where they could shoot at them and one thing or another. So that was my knowledge, and I remember getting into some of those caves, and there were Japanese that had been killed as a result of either bombings and maybe their bodies had been brought back in again.
Let's go back to the flag raising just for a moment. What was that moment like to see the flag raising?
Well, from the vision where we were at the base of Mount Suribachi, where we were being called off the front line back to the rear area, we could look up there, we could see that. We didn't know what was going on. People would try to tell us what was going on, and then we would see the flag go up on the, on the Mount Suribachi, because Suribachi apparently was 500-700 feet up in the air there. It was an ex-volcano.
Was that a big morale boost?
Oh, yes. We thought that was going to be the end of the war. We were attacking, and the American flag going up on the top of Mount Suribachi. We thought this is going to be but it wasn't there. It was just a preliminary invasion because most of the Japanese forces were being directed from the northern part of the island, and through their communication system, they developed from the south. They led infiltration. They would get troops at night to try to get through our lines or try to cause problems with us. You couldn't see the enemy, and you didn't know where they were, but you knew they were trying to get infiltrate through your lines to go through there, and it became very stressful at that time. I couldn't go out at that time and treat anybody. I mean, you stayed in your foxhole and you were ready for Japanese if they jumped into the foxhole with you.
Tell me about the day you were wounded.
I had been told that Sergeant Angelus, and part of the first squad of Company A, part of the infantry section, he was Corporal Angelus, was out in the front lines there, a little bit ahead of where I was dug in. And so I got up and I was able to move. It was daylight at that time. So I was able to get up and I moved ahead. And I found Angelus laying on the ground there, and I laid down beside of him, and as I remember, I lifted his helmet a little bit to the side, and I tried to speak to him, and then I realized that he was dead at that time. And so as I started to get up, I was laying down, I started to get up, all of a sudden, I felt something go through my leg, hit me, and what it was apparently a Japanese sniper was trained in on that area, and he shot me at that time. So at that time, it was kind of ironic as I look back that I realized that I was going to get off that island. I was going to get taken back to a battalion aid station or something. I wouldn't be fighting anymore. I didn't like the idea we were fighting the Japanese that way. There were too many casualties. And I figured I was going to be a complete casualty. So I was able to manage myself to get back. And I remember the first group of guys that I got back was a fella from Salt Lake City. Rufus Egbert was his name, big fella. He was with the machine gun squad and with the 1st Platoon. And he had gone that night or that morning and jumped into a foxhole, but at that time, one of the Marines who was in there, he had a bayonet on the end of his M1, figuring maybe there was going to be hand-to-hand combat, and he was going to have to use that. And when Egbert jumped into the foxhole, he caught it on his foot, and the thing was bleeding quite heavily, and I treated him there and bandaged him up at that time. And I waited to see if I could get back to the battalion aid station and where I was going to be taken care of.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what happened before you did that, because you received the Silver Star for 2 main reasons. First, you refused to evacuate, at least for a while, and you also kept risking your life after you were wounded to treat others. Explain that mindset.
I guess it was just, whether it was human nature or whether it was the training that we had gone through field medical school, where we were taught how to administer first aid to wounded troops and one thing or another. And I just tried to do the best that I could under the situations that I was confronted with.
Where did you go after you were evacuated?
After I was evacuated, they got me back onto the beach area, and they put me on an LCVP, I believe it was, and took me out to the HMS Reaper. It was a British aircraft carrier, and it had come from Australia. And from there, they took me back to Guam, the island of Guam. They had a Base 18 hospital at Guam. And I was taken back medically to Guam. And from Guam, I was taken back to Pearl Harbor. I was not going to do any more fighting or anything else. I guess my wound was healing through my leg and one thing or another, so there wasn't any situation where I was going to be put back into the war again. I was being brought back to a rural area for more medical treatment.
When you think back to your time on Iwo Jima, is there a particular moment or moments that come to mind most often?
No, everything seemed to run together. I mean, you didn't really have time. You worried about your own safety and the safety of the men that you were treating or going to treat, the fellas that you'd been in field training back in Hawaii or back here in the States land. You had grown, what do you call it? Because I was stationed and I lived with these Marines. As a Navy veteran, I was in the Navy, but I spent most of my time with the Marine Corps, and you learned the habits of how Marines were treated and how you lived as a, what do you call it, and as a staff NCO officer, and how you ate with these people. They were your life.
What are you most proud of from your service?
I don't know. I think because I was pretty young, figured 17, to go into the service. It was a kind of a good feeling at that time because I don't know. I did the best that I could. That was all I could ask for.